Hi, friends. Okay, now we're going to talk about the importance and value of skin to skin in those first couple of days. And we're going to talk a little bit about supplementing. So, skin to skin, as most of you know, regulates baby's heart rate, regulates their temperature, regulates their respiration, their breathing, and it regulates their blood sugar, or it helps to regulate their blood sugar. So, it's valuable for all babies. It also helps parents. So, it helps build the bond with parents. It helps parents relax because of oxytocin. You will find it makes them very sleepy. Sometimes that can freak them out. That's actually a really normal response to holding a baby is getting drowsy. And it's because they're exhausted and all that oxytocin really helps them relax. So the obvious response there is to be sleepy. So when you're helping educate them around falling asleep while holding their baby, I think it's important to validate that this is a really normal body response to oxytocin and sort of tips and tricks for making sure that they don't put themselves into a risky situation. But it is very normal for birthing parents, especially, to get drowsy with a baby on their chest. It is by design. So when you're explaining it to them, I usually say things like, we have narrow beds and hard floors here. And so this is not a place where you want to fall asleep with your baby. So if you're feeling really drowsy and you're skin to skin and that baby's tucked in snugly and your rails are up and your partner has eyes on you, and that means no phone, no leaving the room, no distraction, no going to the bathroom, you're okay. If there isn't full eyes on you, you need to swaddle the baby up and put the baby back in the bassinet. I think sometimes we can come from a place of fear, which makes sense because I know that babies fall. But parents, that's not the world they live in. They need to understand it from their own perspective. So kind of walking them through oxytocin, what it does. I also encourage you to explain what skin to skin does and even what skin to skin does with partners. So there's newer research that's come out that basically shows that non-birthing parents can create the same level of oxytocin as a birthing parent when they do lots of skin to skin with their newborn. So it really helps bond non-birthing parents to newborns. And that is such a gift long term. So skin to skin is beneficial for everybody. It especially comes into play from the feeding perspective if you've got a baby with sugars. So skin to skin, but covered, they really need to be warm, especially if they're like a late preterm baby because they like to drop their body temperature and burn a ton of calories. So helping the parents understand all of this is really helpful. But as much skin to skin as parents are up for will help decrease the risk for things like low blood sugar and high weight loss down the road a little bit in the next couple of days. Now I want to talk about supplementing. So we all know that babies have to be supplemented sometimes. I think it can be a slippery slope and be really overwhelming for parents. And it can have a true, deep, and long-term impact on breastfeeding. So we have to look at supplementing really carefully. So for a healthy full-term baby in the first 24 hours, there's only one real reason to supplement a baby. So we're not talking about babies who are in the NICU and separated from their parents. I am talking about babies who are rooming in, who are 38 plus weeks gestation, who have no major risk factors. The only reason to supplement these babies would be a low blood sugar in the first 24 hours of life. That's really it. And I think that's really important information because when we start to supplement in the first 24 hours, it becomes a very slippery slope with supplementation. I recently did a workshop for management of labor and delivery units in the state on writing feeding policies. And I've handed every unit who attended the main general full series of feeding policies. One of the feeding policies in there is on supplementing healthy full-term newborns. So it includes volume ranges for supplementing on day 1, supplementing on day 2, and supplementing on day 3. And I encourage you to have a policy in your hospital on this volume because this prevents one person being told to supplement with 10 mLs and another person being handed a full volume of formula with 2 ounces in it and told to just do your thing. If you have donor milk, you are probably measuring out those volumes. And when you have a guideline, and ABM does have a guideline, you can look it right up. I'm pretty sure on day 1, it's 5 to 10, or actually it might even be lower than that. But I always encourage you to start on the lower number of the recommended supplementation range and then watch the baby. Because when we start at the higher number, then day 2, we have to go to the higher number and we're always on the higher number. If this baby is a good candidate for a small volume and then they seem content and happy, keep them there. The reason is that when you have a parent who is pumping every 3 hours in those first 48 hours of life, and most of them will see nothing when they pump, that plays big tricks on your mind, especially with a baby being supplemented 15, 20, 30 M, and they're still pumping nothing. It will literally make their brain think that they will never make enough milk for their baby. So we always want babies to be fed. That is always a priority. We always want babies not losing too much weight. That is always a priority. But we don't need a baby to gain weight in the first day of life, and we don't need a baby to gain weight in the first 2 days of life. We need to prevent them from losing too much weight and get them fed. So we're trying to keep those volumes of what the parent is pumping and what the baby is getting as close to possible as we can to help facilitate breastfeeding. So first 24 hours, there really isn't a reason other than low blood sugars. If you see a jittery baby, make sure you check on the meds of the birthing parent as well, because very often what looks like low blood sugar symptoms is actually withdrawal from an SSRI or something like that. You can always still check blood sugars. Now, if you are checking blood sugars on a baby and you get a low reading, I encourage you to do it again. I think if you've been in this world for a little bit, you know those glucometers are testy. Sending a serum is going to take a few hours. So just do it a second time. And if it's really off, there's really nothing wrong with doing it a third time. I would rather you poke a baby's foot 3 times and not supplement a baby than poke a baby's foot once and start the supplementing journey. Again, the volume goes up a little bit each day. And then there's the question of discharging a family who is being supplemented. If a baby is getting donor milk and it's pretty consistent with each feed, they're probably going to need a little bit to take home, but they're also going to need a follow-up plan. So sending a supplementing or an exclusively pumping family home with no follow-up plan is the fastest way to end it all. If you've got a dedicated lactation team, ideally, they make the feeding plan. You can help families find local resources. If you don't do outpatient lactation visits, a lot of times the pediatric offices do, or there's local private practice IBCLCs who take insurance that can. Or you can even shift a lot of it over the phone if the right person is having the conversation with them about what it looks like, how much the baby's getting, if they're pumping, what their pumping volume looks like. It doesn't have to be you. It can't be you. But having some type of follow-up plan before they discharge, if they're supplementing on their way out the door, is really important. They also need to be educated on proper formula mixing, no matter how they're supplementing their baby, because chances are if they're supplementing with donor milk, they're going to run out. And they need to understand proper formula mixing. And those instructions are not on the can. So ideally, we also give them proper formula mixing and volume guidelines for the next few days. Supplementing, how you supplement is really a hospital policy problem. I would say some of us are finger feeding, some of us are bottle feeding. I worked in both. I worked in a hospital that wouldn't allow finger feeding. I worked in a hospital that only finger fed. I don't see a huge difference in latches and things like that, whether a baby gets a bottle or not. I also have big feelings about triple feeding, and I'm not a big fan. I think for like a day or two in the hospital in those first couple days, it's not a huge deal, but going home triple feeding feels like a nightmare for most parents. So helping them understand that this is what the best way that you know how to make it work, but there are alternatives, and this shouldn't be a long-term scenario, and triple feeding should not go on past like a week or two for most families. It's certainly not on a full-time basis. And those are little tips and tricks that you can give the families to help them understand that this is meant to be temporary and that they need some type of guidance to be done with it. But how you supplement a baby is less impactful than how much you supplement a baby and the process with which you supplement a baby. I will probably do a whole video series on triple feeding and alternatives to it. But if you've got dedicated lactation in your hospital, they are the ones that can help you the most directly with this because they know what your staff is working with. So remember, skin to skin to skin to skin to skin to skin to skin. If a baby is under 24 hours old and not latching, and you don't have any big red flags that make you think this is going to extend for a long term, skin to skin and some manual like hand expression or pumping and feeding back, anything you get is totally fine for the first 24 hours of life. They don't need to be supplemented. The second 24 hours is a very different story. If they're still not latching, they absolutely need to be supplemented and they need a great plan. I think that's everything.